record and welcome everybody to this month's Lunch and Learn. We got an exciting topic this week because the one thing that I have learned across my travels around the world is no matter where you're at, conflict will follow. If there are people, there are conflicts, and a lot of us, have difficulty navigating some of those, and we might take different approaches. And one of the unique aspects of behavioral elements is really how we can use it as a conflict resolution tool. So, Terry, I'm going to kick it over to you. What are your thoughts when you think about conflict in the workplace? What pops into your brain, or what really kind of keeps you up at night when you think of conflict?
I'm a big proponent that we need to take ownership of our behavior inside of conflict. And so I've delivered a presentation a few times called the 23 B attitudes of difficult discussions or conflict resolution or team building. And in my mind, it all starts internally. And we have to look at the idea very differently than we do. And even on the elemental scale, there are certain elements that are more predisposed to want to be right and want to win, and there are elements that are predisposed to be okay losing or splitting the difference. So it's a really interesting piece. But I'm okay in conflict because I'm here to understand, to learn, and to make things better, right? And so that's always my approach. I just was telling you before we started, I effectively started a conflict on my Facebook page this morning, and just to get people's opinions. And I don't have to be right. And I never have to make anybody wrong. And I think that's a really good starting point to be when in the midst of conflict.
Yeah, I really like that distinction. You don't have to be right, but other people don't have to be wrong. See, in my world, as a high fire element, and also just for context for anybody that doesn't know, I was a collegiate debater. That was actually how I ended up getting my undergraduate degree paid for. I probably wouldn't have gone to college had it not been for debate. I actually posted on that recently, but I was paid money to argue. And it just felt right. It was the right activity for outside of hockey. It was the right activity for me. But I have felt, and I think I've always felt this. I like to be right, but I like us to be right better. Like I would prefer that there is a win-win, and I do think that that's probably a little bit of my air element. But I've never ever shied away from a conflict, and I think we'll get into a little bit of, do I avoid conflict? Do I engage conflict? And what does that mean? And how does that show up? But I guess my question, Terry, is I heard you say, you being a high air element, you're actually looking for discovery and learning through conflict. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think that that is one of the big pieces that organizations fail to make a distinction. They're like, we got to get rid of all conflict. And I'm like, no, actually, conflict can be a really good thing. So, what's your take on that?
It creates understanding if your objective is to create understanding, right? And so I'll make statements and just to test the water and see how people feel about it. And most folks will jump in head first and will tell you exactly what they think. And those that are conflict avoidant won't engage in the conversation. And that's okay. But again, I'm not, you don't have to be wrong, and you can have your opinion, and I'm super good with that. And so I think there's that attitude piece about what you're trying to get out of it that matters. And I agree from a corporation standpoint, conflict's going to be where that learning happens, where that discovery happens. And you're going to end up finding potentially new and better ways to deal with things as a result of conflict.
Yeah, whenever I read anything on conflict, whether it's from Gartner or whether it's from McKinsey, whether it's from the CPP, all of those studies, they always talk about like conflict is costing billions. It leads to disengagement, it leads to lack of retention, it leads to this, that, and the other thing. And I often wonder, where are the articles that talk about innovation that comes from conflict or new solutions or better solutions to some of the existing problems? We don't really get to see the positive side of conflict at all in any of the research because there's a connotation that even comes with the word conflict, meaning, oh my gosh, we are at odds and things are, it almost feels like maybe there needs to be a distinguishing characteristic, right? Like a healthy conflict versus the interpersonal quarreling. And I think that when they're talking about it, it's more of the interpersonal quarreling that is the issue. But for me, I want to be challenged. I really enjoy when people take on one of my arguments. Number one, it does trigger the game in my brain. But number two, I am also like, I will advocate and argue hard for a position or a point. But when at the point in time that I am proven wrong, I'm also the first person to be like, you know what? You're right. We need to go in that direction and kind of take it in that space. So even though I might passionately advocate or argue for something, I am also generally pretty open. And I think that that's where the fire and the air interplays for me. With you and your secondary element, do you see both the air and the water kind of playing that, or how does that show up for you?
I think it does, right? Because that water element shows up in my desire to be empathetic, my desire to actually listen, and my desire to put others' needs in front of mine, let alone on par with mine. And so I think that combination of I want to seek understanding and I'm willing to do the work to listen, to ask the questions, to pay attention, to put myself in your shoes, right? I think that makes for a really good combination of how to deal with conflict. I want to skip back a minute though. You said something about your whether you avoid conflict or you resolve conflict. I'm curious about whether or not you start conflict.
I think in some cases I probably do, and maybe even unintentionally. I think that one of the things that comes along with my fire is opinionated. I can be very opinionated, and I can be very bold with putting my opinions out there, which is not always appreciated. Or sometimes it's appreciated, but I definitely am willing to engage in that. I think that that's probably, and here's the thing though, and I will say this. I generally try, and I would say this is new Jay Johnson, evolved Jay Johnson. I generally try to make it very safe for people to disagree with me, especially like my team or anything else. Like, no, challenge me, please. Tell me why I'm wrong. Let's get to the bottom of this. But I would say that, am I an instigator of conflict? Not for conflict's sake. I think that again would have been my history. I would have probably instigated a conflict just to see what was going to happen. And let's get into this argument because it really was like debate was in part a game, it was an exploration. There's a reason why in debate, you switch sides. In one debate round, you're going to be arguing yes. The next debate round, literally 2 hours later, you're going to be arguing no to the exact same issue. And that was called switch side debating. So you would get to learn the arguments of each of the sides. So for me, it really was a game of advocacy. And I think that that probably carried forward for me for quite a number of years of I thought we were playing a game, and then I realized that other people weren't playing the same game that I was and not being happy about how I was arguing or how I would articulate my point. So I think there's some instances where especially if I see a place where conflict has to happen. Like, okay, look, this is happening and this is happening and it's not getting and people are avoiding it. I'm going to bring that to the table. I'm going to instigate that conflict. I want to get it done because if you're not talking it out, you're acting it out. So let's get it out and try to get this working forward. So I would say I'm an instigator in that aspect, but I'm no longer, I would say that I have shifted my behaviors or behaviorally evolved, that I'm no longer instigating a conflict just for conflict's sake. Does that make sense?
It does, totally, and I love the point about if you're not talking it out, you're acting it out. I've been brought in to do some mediation inside of companies before because I'm a fairly even-keeled individual who asks the right questions, can steer the conversation in an evolved sort of way. And it's really, really true. And you can see people in that situation. You can kind of tell who they are and what side there is. I'm curious about how much does ego get involved and play in the conflict in your mind?
I think quite a bit. We when we think about our ego, here's an interesting thing is every human being has some level of an ego. Otherwise, you wouldn't feel shame, you wouldn't feel guilt, you wouldn't feel remorse, you wouldn't feel jealousy, you wouldn't feel any of those different kind of emotions. So, unless you're a complete psychopath and you don't have access to those emotions, you have some level of ego. No one really likes to be wrong. And if we trace that back, if we like even think from the elements, the ancestral relationship to that is if you were wrong or if you made the mistake or anything else like that, you could get excommunicated from your tribe, drive to bond. You would not be able to acquire your resources. You may not necessarily be able to defend your position, etc. So, I mean, we even see that kind of associated with the drives. Where I see ego in conflict now is kind of going back to something that you said, the inability to recognize how did I contribute to this conflict by either doing or not doing. And that is a key thing. And this is something that I ask myself whenever I'm in a conflict mode. How have I contributed to this conflict by either doing or not doing? And if you ask yourself that, I can look and say, how many times do people wait and they tolerate a behavior or they tolerate some kind of action and they let it slide, they let it slide, they let it slide, they let it slide until that behavior is almost normalized and then blow up at it, right? Rather than whispering 1,000 times, they scream once, and then they don't understand necessarily their own responsibility for allowing that behavior to occur. And that behavior that kept, manifesting and creating the conditions for stress or anxiety. I'll give an example of just being late. Somebody comes in late once, most people are going to be like, yeah, big deal. They were late by a couple of minutes, not an issue. But if it's a pattern of behavior, we start to get frustrated. And if we're not addressing that behavior, we're probably acting out that behavior. If we're not talking it out, we're acting it out. So now we might just be like making passive aggressive comments, or we might think that we're moving the needle by not having a conversation, but saying something, like, oh, it's important that we're all on time and we remember, and it's all everybody else was on time except the one person. You're still not addressing that behavior. And I really am somebody that says, from an ego standpoint, we don't want to be wrong. We don't want to get into a position where we look bad. We don't want to get into a position where we might find something out about ourselves or our own culpabilities in a conflict. So maybe we just kind of pull back and avoid it. And I think that that's where that comes from.
That makes a ton of sense to me, and I see that that don't want to be wrong. I'm not sure if that's the same as have to be right. Right, and it's interesting because conflict, and you kind of alluded to it. It's such a nuanced thing, and conflict is not a nuanced term. It's such a general over uh, uh, generalization. It's overly generalized. I'm trying to come up with a word here. And there's so many different levels of conflict. And I'm not sure, I'm sorry if it's Neil or Nelly, but they're posted in here. They don't call it conflict, but a discussion here.
Mm.
And I appreciate that as as softening language, but I'm not sure that everything needs to be softened, right? And I miss the days, not of being a jerk, but when we could call things what they were and people were okay with it. And nowadays it does. It seems like we've gone, pendulum swing, and in the overcorrecting of political correctness, we've taken the teeth out of a lot of things. Well, if you're trying to eat, teeth are helpful, right? They come in very, very handy for, chewing. And I think a lot of times conflict needs to be chewed on. And so having the teeth out of it doesn't really, in my mind, doesn't necessarily help. What do you think of that, Jay?
When I look at something like how do we frame it or how do we phrase it, I often kind of go back to the idea of, and I like that, right? Because there are instances where maybe it feels like conflict, but it's actually a discussion. There are instances when it is a disagreement. There are instances where it is an interpersonal quarrel. And one of the things about our language is there's so many different ways to say the same thing that may land or may not necessarily land. Excuse me. So what I would look at is how how would you want to look at it that will allow you to engage in it? Because there are some people that are just flat out conflict avoidant or conflict averse. They don't want to engage in anything that's either going to make them right or make them wrong, and that comes maybe a little bit from the ego. Sometimes it comes from empathy and not wanting to step on your toes by making you wrong or making you look wrong. But I do think that it's really important that we separate sometimes a disagreement from our own identity. And this is a challenge. This is when somebody really kind of wraps themselves up into their idea, their beliefs, their attitudes, and they hold on to that stronger than anything. One of the things that ultimately can happen is that they feel like the attack or, a disagreement is an attack on their person rather than necessarily an attack on the idea or a disagreement with the idea. So I like to frame it in, all right, what type of conflict is this? Is this a conflict of ideas, a conflict of beliefs, a conflict of values, a conflict of ideas, a conflict of behaviors? Where is the conflict? And then that's going to help me figure out whether or not I'm going to navigate that with a conversation, whether I'm going to navigate with that with a policy or a procedure, or navigate that with a, hey, let's brainstorm how to overcome this challenge and problem together. Does that make sense?
100%. And that really, that if anything speaks to the nuance of conflict, what is it a conflict of is a great example, right? Because we spend so much time focused on potentially the wrong thing. And going back to ego, if you think it's an attack on identity, you're going to get into the fight or flight posture a lot quicker than if you think it's a conflict of ideas. And I fighting in conflict um, works about this much, hand held high with a half of inch showing in the pinchers. It works that much better than avoiding the conflict altogether. And I appreciate that as a distinction. So, do you just ask the question? How do you ferret out what the conflict is actually about?
Yeah, I think in some cases it's almost like we know it and maybe we don't want to admit it, right? And here's my example. Your best friend brings in, I use this sometimes. Your best friend brings in pizza to the office on Friday, and you're like, oh, what a great person. Your mortal enemy brings in pizza to the office the following Friday, and you're like, God, they got crappy pizza, or they're doing this just to suck up. And we're going to immediately turn that into a negative. So when we're finding ourselves and looking at the behavior, and I ask myself, if my best friend exhibited this behavior, would I still have this conflict? If my best friend had this idea, would I still be in conflict with this? And that's going to give me an idea of whether or not I'm actually battling the idea or the person that's sitting across from me. If I'm battling the person that's sitting across from me, I'm going to take ownership of that and say, hey, you need to back off. I need to check some assumptions, and I really need to evaluate this from a more logical standpoint. If it is one of those things where it is the idea that I'm actually looking at, then it's okay, let's present my position and let's see what the reaction to that position is. So I also want to I see Stuart's comment in the chat, not experiencing conflict. I really like that, Stuart, because and please, team, jump in there with questions or comments in the chat. But Stuart, I really like this because sometimes we created a pattern of behavior. And that could be done by, we were nurtured that way, where we were told, hey, don't argue, don't get into an argument, don't have conflict or anything else. And we were pushed to not necessarily engage or advocate. And maybe we don't have a lot of experience in having a healthy conflict or even sometimes unhealthy conflict. Or we've just been somebody that has, over the course of time, found it more easy or more comfortable for ourselves to not engage in a conflict and created a pattern of behavior. So now it's really difficult if I have to step into that conflict space. But you're right, just like anything else, conflict or discussion or argument or advocacy, all of those, and even dealing with difficult people, the more we do it, the more that our brain trains itself to be able to do that. And that's really where I think the elements come in. And I'm going to turn Nellie's question over to you, Terry. Do you see a difference between the different elements and how they react to different conflicts? And I've got I've got a I've got a working theory, and obviously we do see specific behaviors that come from each of the elements in different ways of having conflict. But I really like the kind of nuance of her question of, is it something that's going to be different in interpersonal versus is it going to be something different in, say, ideological? What do you think?
So yes, I think there is a difference between the elements, wholeheartedly. I think how they approach it, and I think the example between Jay and I is a really good starting point. We don't have a high earth person, but between the two of us, we cover water, air, and fire pretty darn well. For me, as the highest air. I lean into that understanding and that learning and that trying to step into it, but come up with problems to solve it because I don't want conflict to linger. And so the my air takes over in conflict, but it's backed by the water element of that listening, that asking the questions, and that actually putting myself in other people's shoes. So I think there's a really good balance there. And I think you probably have a tendency, Jay, to be more direct in it and to the point. But so that might be your natural behavior and your natural response. But I'm curious as to how different, with your excessive knowledge in behavioral drivers, how different your adapted behavior is.
Yeah, and that's kind of the key thing, is understanding the drives helps me to sort of navigate that. But here's where I would look at, if it is a ideological belief system, business sort of conflict, I will engage, and I will engage passionately. I will keep an open mind, especially if somebody is able to communicate how their position or their representation is going to help me win, right? Where I disengage is if I feel like it's an interpersonal quarrel that doesn't have a value proposition to me. And at that point in time, it's not worth my time, not worth my energy, and I'm just going to be like, whatever. So there's a really interesting theory called the anticipation of future interaction. And this is one that helps guide whether or not I'm going to engage or avoid a conflict. When your anticipation for future interaction is high, that generally means you're going to see this person again and again. You're going to have to do business with them. You're going to have to interact with them. So this could be a colleague, a coworker, a team member, a manager, or whomever. If I have a conflict in that space, I'm almost always going to engage it, because otherwise I know my propensity to allow something to kind of get out of control if I'm not managing it directly, just like you said. If my anticipation of future interaction is low, say I'm at a grocery store and the clerk that is, ringing me up starts arguing with me about something, that's going to be one that I'm just like, my anticipation for future interaction so low, I can go to a different grocery store, I can go to a different line, I can go to self checkout. I don't have to see this person ever again in my life. This person's not worth my time to argue with or have a conflict with. I'm out. So I think you see it from a fire element. I think you can see definitely a direct engagement, but I think fire also elements also generally don't have the patience to deal with something that's not necessarily going to provide value or add value to their lives. Now, every now and then it'll become a game and a competition of like, no, I'm just going to own this person at the grocery store or wherever it is. And that's maybe where that modified behavior comes from. I do want to speak I want to speak real quick to the earth side of things. And here's how I'm going to kind of position it. If you think about the behavioral elements, we have the wheel. On the left side of the wheel, you see more individualistic. That's the fire and the earth. On the right side of the wheel, you tend to see more of the collaborative side, the air and the water. Now, what does that mean? So, from an earth perspective, argument is going to be really focused in logic. And if the other side is more of an interpersonal quarrel, Earth is kind of going to look at it almost like the fire element and just be like, this isn't worth it. I want to look at the system. I want to look at the process. I want to look at where the issue or the breakdown is, less interested in sort of that interpersonal side of things. However, the Earth does have, and this is where the nuance of the elements comes, Earth has a strong sense for justice and fairness because justice and fairness is predictable. So if you are on the other side of the earth elements, justice, fairness, sort of like this is right and this is wrong, the earth will take you up on that argument and they will hold the line. And it is just like the element icon, you're trying to move a mountain. And I think that that is something to be thinking about how that element really does show up in conflict in different ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I love that. And that makes a ton of sense. And Earth is known to try and split the difference a lot of times, right? Going back to that fairness piece. But I think about my wife, right, who is water first, but I believe that is totally adaptive. I think she's become water first. I think she is earth at her core. And when, like you, when presented with a logical argument, she'll stop in a heartbeat, right? And she'll never say you're right, but I think that's a spouse thing more than a behavioral thing. But she will absolutely stop and rethink her position. But if you don't have supporting facts, she'll just keep arguing, man, and believe she's right.
Well, and that's the thing is you're going to have to be able to give facts or some kind of reason, rationale, or analysis that either the Earth has not already considered and is willing to go back and reconsider, or alternatively, that makes more sense for whatever their system or process is, how they're evaluating that argument. So when we think about like the presentation of when we think about the presentation of conflict between the elements, we tend to see a lot of and even think about it from an individual, right? If we think about ourselves first, we can simultaneously be excited about change, but really, really nervous about it. So when you see the air element and the earth element interacting, a lot of times an air element or the unstructured, even a fire and air element, can really create a lot of uncertainty or instability for an earth element or a water element. And that can create some tension. If Jay comes in flying into the office and I'm like, Terry, I've got a great idea. Let's try this. You, being a high earth, are going to be like, yeah, awesome. Let's do it. If I come in and do that and my office is filled with earths, they're going to start going, whoa, 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 whoa. Wait, how are you going to pay for that? What is this going to look like? How are you going to do this? And they're going to want literally a logical plan or a process to go forward with and not just Jay Johnson's classic line of, don't worry about it. We'll figure all that out as we go. So we can see the tension even internally between the drives. And that manifests in many cases of how we see conflict. Almost every single true like argument, belief, value, attitude type conflict. And I'm not talking about just interpersonal. A water can hate a water just as easy as a fire can hate a fire, on an interpersonal side of things. But when we look at an actual like conflict over some kind of issue, generally I look to the drives first and I'm never disappointed to be able to go, this person is looking for this, this person is looking for this person's motivated by X, this person's motivated by Y, and this is where that tension's coming in. That's why I use this in that coaching and another number of other spaces.
Quick edit to what Jay just said is there was a slight misspeak when he said, if I come running in saying I've got a great idea, Terry is a high earth, he meant Terry is a high air, right? Not Terry's the high earth isn't going to be like, great, let's go, as he pointed out shortly thereafter. Just to make sure we're all on the same page.
Absolutely.
Um,
I got
I
my
there's
earth.
a
Yeah, I got my earth mixed up there.
That's it. Yeah. Now listen, we all know Terry is not a high earth.
Neither
That
is
is,
Jay.
yeah, the earth. I can barely spell that stuff. So there's a point here in one of the Q and A's that at the tail end of the, we call conflict discussion. Um, a conflict seen as a negative, but a discussion isn't. So you can disagree in a meeting and then it's over. And after the meeting, you let it go and defend whatever is agreed upon. Not all are good in that letting go, though. And so I'm curious, from an elements perspective, are some elements more likely to let things go versus hold on to things and grudges for far too long? I would assume they are.
Yeah, I definitely have an opinion of what I have seen over the course, and I'm going to comment on Bridget's comment in there, and I know Bridget quite well. She will keep us both in line. She is a high earth and very, very good at what she does. So,
Bridget's my new best friend.
yeah,
Her and
right.
Kathy.
I think people with a stronger drive to bond are probably going to be a little bit more forgiving, a little bit more understanding, a little bit more considerate. People with a drive to learn, the air element, are going to be a little bit more open to curiosity in letting something go. So curiously, like actually engaging it to try to understand why it happened, how it happened, what happened, and solve that problem. I think when you go to the opposite side of the wheel and you start looking at fire and earth, uh, earth, they've got that system of fairness. So you're either on this side or you're on the other side. And I think that earth has probably got lower patience when it comes to letting something go or to tolerating a certain set of behaviors. They're going to expect accountability. They're going to expect you to take responsibility. And at the end of an argument, if you've not necessarily proven your innocence or proven your proven that you are taking steps to resolve it, that's probably not going to get let go. And even if it is, it's going to be under consideration. Fire, again, I think it's going to go back to not letting it go because you won this round, my friend, but I will get you on the next round, or letting it go of this just isn't worth my time or energy or effort and forget about it. So that's really where I love the nuances of the elements because when we think of even something, and we had a nice conversation about this internally, the elements, it's not either or, right? It's the behaviors that are more likely to occur. So like I have a very strong drive to acquire my fire element, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually motivated by money, right? I'm more motivated by mastery. I'm more motivated by results and et cetera than I am, say, something like the actual acquisition of resources. So we can find the nuances in each of these individual elements and how they show up. Water can be exceptional as a diplomat inside of conflict. They can navigate it, ask the right questions, they can coach, they can do this. Water can also look at conflict and go, nope, not going to get involved. I'd rather just take care of this myself. I'll put it on my own back or shelter that, or I'll take care of the team so that way it's not rocking anybody's boat. It's not an either or. It really does come to that space of being able to, how can I navigate this and what is my motivation behind either engaging or avoiding? I want to bring your attention. We've got a question in the chat. How do you deal with people who create conflict when none ever existed, other than, say, something like a disciplining conversation?
Hmm. Yeah. So for me, as someone who's direct and interested in resolving conflict, I would pull them aside and have that conversation and ask why. What value do they find? Why do they bring that up? Why are they in that posture and in that position? And really try to get to the root cause and understand, and not be accusatory and not be disciplinarian, but try and create that understanding, um, and do it in a way that illuminates it. Because I'm pretty sure, and Jay will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm pretty sure there are people that do conflict for conflict's sake and aren't even sure they're doing it. It's almost unconscious.
Yeah, it's kind of like the sixth sense. I see difficult people. They're everywhere. They don't even know they're difficult.
Yeah, man.
I saw
The
I saw Elizabeth comment, water and earth, probably very structured, team focused. You want the best. You want to create that system and process for sustainability and fairness so that way everybody can thrive. I love the way that water and earth actually shows up in conflict when you have a good balance between those. It's a really positive influence in many cases for conflict. I'm gonna
yeah.
I'm gonna jump on that question too, a little bit, Terry. I agree with you 100%. Coming at it from a curiosity. So if you know the elements, and the beauty of this part of the beauty of this program is that it's easily accessible. Even just through a few conversations or even reading your profile results, you're going to get a pretty good indication of where those drives show up. So the first thing that I would suggest, and it was anonymous user, so I'm not calling you out by name, but the first thing I suggest there, anonymous, is think about that person's drives. Are they a high flyer? Do they seem to be competitive? Are they more focused on results and acquisition? Are they more of a earth? Are they more process focused on always want all the details and systematic, etc.? And really look at why are they creating conflict? Because if they're creating it from nothing, always think about this. Behavior is a necessity. Okay. We don't do anything by accident. We have all of the different neurotransmitters that are in our brain that are telling us do this, do this, do this, do this. And it all comes from some kind of reason. As Terry said, if we can be curious and find out what is the reason or what are they trying to get from this, that's going to give us some insight of how we want to deal with it. Are they feeling marginalized? Are they feeling like their voice isn't being heard? Are they feeling like they're retaliating against everybody that has wronged them? Like are they feeling like I don't know, a number of different things. But when we look at them and say, okay, well, what is their element? What do we think their primary drive is? I can tell you right now, I will create a conflict. And in the event that I don't feel like my voice is getting heard as a fire element, I will create a conflict and I will be direct on it. And I will get in there and I will start the fires in order for my voice to be heard. That's going to happen. Um, if I'm feeling like I was at least listened to, I'm willing to back away from that and say, okay, well, this may not be my decision. Here's my opinion, and I'm okay to step back. For an earth element, if it is something where the conflict is coming because people are constantly violating the rules, not following procedures, not following policies, not doing this, they're going to instigate that conflict, even if there is no other, if there's no other earths in that space, they will instigate that conflict to make sure that the rules and processes and procedures are being followed. If it's a water element, maybe they're not feeling connected. Maybe they're not feeling maybe they're not feeling necessarily brought into the conversations or that consensus, that they're not being leveraged for their opinion. If it's air element, in many cases, it might just be that, hey, I'm trying to learn from this, or I'm trying to bring this up to understand or be better. And maybe I don't have the interpersonal skills to do that in a functional way like Terry does, but maybe it's really coming from a place of curiosity. So I would start with being curious about what is driving them towards that conflict. And then, yeah, opening up a dialogue and having the conversation. I noticed that you started X. This has led me to believe Y. And can you help me understand by telling me Z, and giving them that opportunity to bring it to the forefront?
I'd also be curious if they're having conflict with the same small group of people or if it's a lot more universal, right? Because back to Jay's earlier point about is it interpersonal or ideological, that would give you some interesting indicators. Um, Jay, I have written about and spoken about the idea of 54 shades of gray, right? The idea that we have really, really, really light gray that looks white. We have really, really, really dark gray that looks black, and 52 shades in between those, and that life isn't black or white. Are black and white, are earth people and or fire people black and white, and water people and airy people like myself see the world as more shades of gray? Is that elemental, or is that just some other weirdness that I have?
No, I think that I think it can definitely be looked at from the elemental side, right? Like if we think about the wheel again, the top level, fire and air, very unstructured. And that's what gives us that sort of span of gray. Uh, Fire is going to look at it a little bit differently than the earth element. It's going to be, I'll take the gray that gives me the best advantage to win, to get the results, or to do whatever it is, especially if it's unchecked fire. When we think about earth, and that doesn't mean that Earth is always inflexible or rigid, but generally it means that Earth has thought about this and literally evaluated all 54 shades of gray and said, this is the most optimal shade. This is the one that's going to appeal to the most amount of people. This is the one that's going to get us to that space. And I'm going to stick with that one shade until proven otherwise that this shade is better. So it's not necessarily something that I look at Earth and say they're always inflexible or always rigid or anything else. It's that they've probably put their own work into making an analysis and saying, I can get repeatable, sustainable results by doing it this way every single time. Whereas an air element's constantly going, okay, if I tweak this and modify this and maybe just did this and shift this over here a little bit, could I get a better result? Yes or no? And feeling more confident and comfortable in navigating sort of that uncertainty than, say, an earth element might be. Water elements more structured, but water elements are going to generally be more structured because they're more concerned about changes in potential relationships or impacts on people. So they're not going to want a whole wide sweeping range of gray because water is going to be going, okay, well, how does that light gray impact our legal department? How does that dark gray impact finance? How does that other gray impact X, Y, and Z? And they're going to be thinking about the impact it has on the people, the teams, and the entity as a whole. Does that make sense?
It does. It
Yeah.
does. I am more airy than watery. I will say that. So it makes sense to me. I if you were to be prescriptive, right? If you're in front of a team, an organization that conflict rules the day, do you have suggestions very specifically? Would you say, hey, you need to be more curious like air to try and get to the root of it. You need to use your good watering skills to actually be a listener and empathetic, and you need to be earthy and try and find the fair resolution. And if it's somebody outside of your team, then you can be at all the fire you want. But internally, firing conflict may not be the best course of action. At least so far, it doesn't sound like it. So maybe this is a two-part question. When does fire actually help in a conflict resolution?
Yeah, I would look at it and say, and what I think you're speaking to, Terry, is absolutely what I advocate. Balance, right? It's got to be balanced. We have to, if I'm always competitive, I am going to be standing on an island by myself because nobody's going to want to play with me anymore because I'm going to be considered argumentative or I'm going to be considered, not listening or anything else like that. However, when we think about fires, fires are generally pretty good at drawing boundaries. And I think that that is where a fire can really be valuable in an internal or an external conflict, that they're willing to say, hey, listen, this is the line. We're not going to cross that line. I'm going to be very direct and clear with that line, and I'm going to advocate for that line in a passionate way. When we think about, say, the other elements, yeah, if I enter into a conflict coming from a place of learning, like, all right, this is going to be more curiosity focused, I'm going to be more open to listening. I'm going to be more open to change. I'm going to be more open to collaborative responses as opposed to competitive responses. And that can be a really big, powerful thing, especially even in a negotiation and looking for a win-win, or in conflict, looking for the win-win. If I'm tapping into my water element, I'm not just going to be thinking about my personal win. I'm also going to be thinking about how can I navigate this in a way where maybe my idea comes out, but the other person still leaves. Like, that's one thing that I say even in negotiations. I want the other person to leave that negotiation feeling valued, heard, respected, and that they're going to come back and have another negotiation with me at some other point in time. Same is true in conflict. I want the other person to feel like they have a voice inside of that conflict. And I think we've all been in a position where somebody's come up and said, "We need to talk." And you're like, you feel like you have no agency, you feel like you have no ability to say no or control or anything else. That's the last thing I want. And that's really kind of leaning into that drive to bond to make sure the other person's just as safe. From the earth side, I want to be logical. I want to look at this in a process. I don't want to have multiple conflicts and have 67 different resolutions to the same conflict over and over again. Like, how can we get to a place where you feel good, I feel good, my needs are met, your needs are met, but if this situation comes up again, we've already got the solution and we don't have to waste time on it. We've got a good process in place to manage that conflict in the future. That's why I think balance is really important. But from a fire and I'll just say my own confessions, I have found that in my internal team, you're right. I need to pull my fire back a lot more and really activate my drive to bond, my drive to learn and listen twice as much, if not three times as much, as I want to necessarily speak. And that's why I use the 2-to-1 rule. Simple rule. You can take this with you. 2 questions for every 1 response. It's going to give you a much better approach in conflict because you're going to ask those questions, get information, and then you're able to give your response rather than necessarily just firing out whatever comes next. That's a great rule that I try to use.
I love that a lot. As you were talking about fire, I hearkened back to watching the Tom Brady roast the other day. And there was a scenario, evidently, when Tom agreed to do it, he said, "No jokes about my kids, no jokes about Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots." And the roastmaster general, Jeff Ross, got up and made a shady little massage parlor joke at Robert Kraft's expense. And Tom Brady, who I would have to assume has a pretty high fire drive, probably pretty high, got up and said, "Don't do that expletive again." Right? It was the only time he left the chair. He got up and said it loud enough into the mic. He was whispering it into Jeff's ear, but the mic was, 10 inches away. So it was picked up. And it wasn't conflict, but you could tell for him it certainly was, because Jeff just went back and did his story. So that was direct, it was clear, it was short and sweet and to the point, and it didn't happen. There were 2.5 hours after that and zero more jokes about Robert Kraft.
Got the point out there. And that's one of the things to think about too, is like, for example, one of my business partners, Jennifer Mansfield, she's also very, very high in fire. And the two of us, we can argue back and forth. We can get into a passionate discussion and everything else. And then afterwards be like, "You want to grab a beer? Yeah, let's do it." And we're fine. And everything's perfectly okay because it was more of us just, passionate advocacy. Everybody looking on the outside's like, that was scary. Like, we thought we were going to yell at each other. So I think that sometimes that directness or that passion that can come through can be seen as a little intimidating. And that's one of the reasons to kind of pull that fire back. But from your analysis of Tom Brady, yeah, I would say it was, you've crossed a line. And there is an element of the drive to bond in there, right? I'm protecting my family. I'm protecting, the leader or my mentor or whomever it is, whatever he would consider the relation, obviously like owner, but like whatever that relationship is, he's protecting that. And you get a fire and water, and I know we have a couple that are on here. You get a fire and water. Never mess with the waters, never mess with the team of a fire person that's got that fire forefront or fire backing. They're going to come out. They're going to make sure that they are very direct in protecting that team. And that's a powerful interaction between fire and water, especially when those are your primary and secondary.
So that
We
mama bear approach.
That's right. We got about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure that your questions are answered, audience. If you do have any other questions, pop them in there or, comment in the chat. Do you find yourself more avoiding conflict? Do you find yourself more engaging conflict? And let's give a couple of tactics here, Terry. Say you're in a situation, you find yourself in a conflict at work. How are you going to navigate that? Walk me through your process. What are you going to do to either, obviously you're going to tap into your curiosity, your empathy, but what does that look like from your perspective of how do you navigate conflict? What are some tips and tactics that they can take away from here?
So for me, I as low earth as I am, I do like that fairness piece, right? So I'm always interested in what's the desired outcome.
Mm,
What's my desired outcome? What's your desired outcome? And how do we figure out how to meet somewhere in the middle, right? Because much like a negotiation, while there is winners and losers, there doesn't have to be, right? And if we can figure out it, sometimes it's really clear, right? Sometimes I'm just wrong or they're just wrong, and I will dig in and argue the side that's going to lead to the right answer. But other times when it's nebulous and you're not really sure what the right path is, um I'll sit with it and I'll sit with them until we can hammer it out. And I'm much more akin to and much more likely to ask a bunch of questions than make a bunch of declarative statements.
mm.
Right? Because I truly believe that if we allow the questions to do the heavy lifting, and you said 2 to 1 earlier, and I'm like, it's probably more like 5 or 6 to 1, but okay. Um,
Spoken like a
if
fire.
yeah, exactly. If you can do it in 2 notes, baby, name that tune. But I like the idea of digging in and trying to get to that resolution. I'm also willing to sit through it and go through it, and B, because I think that's important, because I want to resolve it and I want it to be like we both agree, even if we agree to disagree, but we need to move past this now, because if it lingers into tomorrow or next week or next month, nipping it in the bud becomes that much harder the longer it goes on.
I agree with that. And I really like that. Thinking about the outcome, like what is the best possible outcome that we can have? How do we want our relationship to look in the future? How do we want to make sure that I'm not coming to work stressed, you're not coming to work stressed, and that we can, it's almost, it feels the way that you're saying it, it's almost like North Star mission focused. Like, let's put this above everything else, whether it's interpersonal or ideological. If we've got a North Star and say we both want these things, that's actually been one of my tactics. And I didn't think about that outcome is like, what are 5 truths that we both agree with? We both want this. We both see this. We both need this. We both want X and we both want Y. Whatever those 5 truths that we can kind of collectively look at and say we agree on, that becomes that North Star of, okay, everything else is just how do we get to those things? So I love that outcome approach. That's really, it's definitely something that I think I'm gonna steal from you a little bit and be like, all right, outcome, let's get that as our North Star. For me, it's almost the opposite way. Is for me and anybody that is more, I'm gonna say on the fire side or maybe on the earth side, I ask myself a question that kind of goes back to that concept of anticipation of future interaction, but I take it even broader. Is this the hill that I need to die on today? And, when I think about that, conflict as we kind of started this conversation is a two-way street. There's There's no innocent and no guilty party in a conflict. We all contribute either by doing or not doing. And I've really accepted that in my own space. So in a number of conflicts, I have to ask myself, is this the hill that I want to die on? Sometimes it is. And at that point in time, that fire is going to come out and it's going to come out hot. Uh, Not necessarily mean or aggressive, but it's just going to be, I'm going to be passionate. I'm going to hold my ground. It's going to be difficult to shift my perspective or ideas. I will be open to it if proven that there's a better way, right? But when I think about, when I think about the number of times that I've gotten into a conflict and then looked back on it and said, was that really necessary? Would that have resolved itself 2 days later had I not decided to jump in there and take an action right now? Is that something that I could have maybe handled with a little bit more grace or a little bit more curiosity or a little bit more consideration? So for me and me personally, I have to check myself before I do any of the conflict resolution. It's almost always internal. I got to take a deep breath. I got to make sure that I'm coming at it from the right place, that I do want to look at those outcomes and what the best solution is. And I need to decide, am I arguing because I want to win? Or am I arguing because I'm truly passionate and I think that this is the best idea for everybody involved in the organization? Is it more me focused and ego focused, or is it more us and we focused? And when I ask myself those questions, it does help to say, maybe this isn't the hill I'm going to die on today. Maybe this is wrong for Jay, but it's not wrong, or it's not wrong for the team. And I can step back from that and show some grace and show some openness to, other opinions more effectively, at least. That's really my approach or how I look at conflicts.
I like that a lot. I'm a proponent of the idea that the business has rights. And so as a result, I usually in work related conflict, I try and keep in mind that what's best for Terry and what's best for the company aren't likely or aren't always going to be the same thing.
Sure.
And so if I can remove myself from the situation, right? And almost play that third party observer role, that becomes a more interesting way to engage. And I think that's what frees me up to be more empathetic, to be more inquisitive, to be more curious and to try and get to that resolution faster.
I love that. I think about it, if you look at a sales team and a legal team that's in conflict. Sales wants the contract, they want the revenue. The legal team says, easy, it's not the best terms for us. We can't sign off on that. They both want the same thing. They want the company to be successful. They're just looking at it, one from a defend and one from an acquire standpoint. And I think that's where we can kind of round it off today is, if you find yourself in conflict, really ask yourself what's driving or motivating that conflict, and really take a step back and think about that other person and say, what's driving and motivating their conflict? That's when we can see those flashpoints, those clash points, and maybe take a step back and think about some different ways that we might approach it so that way we can all win and have the best win-win outcomes. So, Terry,
Love it.
final words from you as we round out our last minute or two here together.
I enjoyed this conversation. I feel like I learned a lot, even though I was participating in it. And I think we did a good job not fighting at all throughout the entire hour. So well done.
No argument or conflict here, my friend. No, I appreciate you. Thank you, audience, for joining us in this month's Lunch and Learn. Stay tuned next month. Our Tuesday session, we're going to be announcing that topic here shortly, but hopefully you're able to take some different learnings away from this and be able to navigate conflict, from that behavioral side of things and evaluating. So thank you for joining us here today. And until next time, behave intelligently, friends.